63 years old, and you still show up to my events like you belong here. Dad, you're an embarrassment. Everything you touch turns to dust. Raymond is a real man. He built something. You just swept up after other people your whole life. My son-in-law said that. He said it at my daughter's birthday dinner, in front of 40 guests, in a private dining room I had quietly paid for without telling a single soul. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I picked up my glass of water, took one slow sip, and set it back down with the same care I'd used to set down every single thing in Marcus Hale's life for the past 7 years. And in that moment, while the room held its breath and my daughter stared at her plate, and 40 people waited to see an old man crumble, I felt something settle inside me, like concrete finally curing. Cold, hard, permanent. My name is Howard Briggs. I'm 63 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I have worked as a civil engineer in Knoxville, Tennessee. I want to tell you exactly what happened, from the beginning, because if you've ever quietly held something up while the people standing on top of it called you weak, you already know how this story ends. But I want you to hear how we got there. I want to say something clearly before I go any further, because it matters. I tried. I want you to know that before you judge anything else, I didn't wake up one morning and decide to build a man's entire world in secret. That came later, and it came because the first way didn't work. When my daughter Claire married Marcus Hale 8 years ago, I saw the warning signs the way an engineer sees a crack in a load-bearing wall, small on the surface, serious underneath. Marcus was 31, charming, loud, the kind of man who filled every room with himself and left no space for anybody else's air. He had a proposal for a real estate investment company he called Pinnacle Group, a PowerPoint presentation full of words like synergy and disruptive positioning, and approximately zero actual capital. But Claire loved him the way young people love things they don't fully understand yet completely, without reservation, with both hands. So, I sat down with Marcus, man to man, at my kitchen table over 2 cups of coffee. I told him I'd spent 30 years building things that had to hold weight, and that the most important lesson I ever learned was that a foundation isn't glamorous. Nobody photographs the foundation. Nobody brags about the foundation, but everything standing on top of it owes its life to what's underneath. I offered to bring him on at my firm, to teach him land development from the ground up, to spend 2 years working side by side so he could understand the real thing before he went off to build his dream version of it. He smiled at me with that easy, practiced smile and said he appreciated the offer, but that he wasn't really a start-from-the-bottom kind of person. I nodded. I poured him more coffee, and I made a different plan. Because here's what Marcus didn't know about me, and what Claire had never fully understood either. The quiet man who showed up to family dinners in a 20-year-old truck and wore the same 3 sport coats on rotation was not a man without resources. I had spent 30 years doing exactly what he'd dismissed, building things that held weight, and over those 30 years, through careful investments and an almost embarrassing lack of interest in spending money on appearances, I had accumulated something considerable. Not flashy, never flashy, but real, the way a bedrock foundation is real, invisible, and load-bearing, and everywhere beneath your feet. When Marcus came to me 6 months later, with a deal that had fallen through because he didn't have enough capital to close it, a small commercial property in West Knoxville that he was absolutely certain would triple in value, I told him my retirement funds were tied up and I couldn't touch them. Marcus called me old-fashioned and went looking for other money. What I didn't mention was that I'd already purchased that property myself, through a holding company in Delaware that had no obvious connection to my name, and that I had leased it to a property management group that would, in turn, offer it to a promising young real estate company called Pinnacle Group at a rate so favorable it would look like a stroke of luck. And that was how it began. Over the next 6 years, my attorney, a meticulous woman named Diane Forsyth, who had been my financial counsel since my late wife passed, and who I trusted more than almost anyone alive, helped me build a structure that was, I'll admit, something of a masterpiece. Not because I'm boasting, but because it took genuine care. The kind of care Marcus would never have understood, because the kind of care I'm describing is invisible. It doesn't ask for credit. It just holds things up. Through Diane, I established a series of holding companies and a blind trust that quietly became the largest silent investor in Pinnacle Group, owning 58% of the equity through a shell investment firm we called Cumberland Capital. We hired a semi-retired real estate professor named Dr. Bill Ashford to serve as the friendly face of Cumberland, a believable man with genuine credentials who could meet with Marcus, shake his hand, and tell him what he needed to hear, which was that Cumberland believed in his vision, and here was the money to prove it. Marcus pitched his heart out. He flew to a meeting in Charlotte, a meeting that Diane had arranged, in a conference room that Diane had rented, with a man who was on my payroll, and walked out with a check and the unshakable belief that the marketplace had finally recognized his genius. He never asked why it had been so easy. In my experience, people who believe they deserve things rarely do. The commercial property in West Knoxville became 3 properties. Pinnacle Group grew. Marcus hired staff, moved into a glass-walled office in downtown Knoxville, and began buying himself the accessories of a man who had arrived. He leased a black SUV through the company, a lease held by one of my holding companies, masquerading as a fleet management service. He moved Claire into a beautiful, renovated craftsman home in Sequoia Hills, one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. A home in a building I had purchased outright 4 years earlier, and offered to Pinnacle Group tenants through a property manager who worked quietly for me. The lease was incentivized, nearly free, contingent on continued employment and good standing. Marcus signed it without reading past the first page. And month after month, I watched from the outside. I came to Sunday dinners and listened to Marcus describe his own brilliance in escalating detail. I watched him mentor younger men at the firm in the art of appearing successful. I watched him buy a boat. I watched him tell Claire that her father was a sweet old man, but that she shouldn't take career advice from someone who'd spent his life working for other people. I tried one more time, about 3 years in. I took Marcus to lunch, just the 2 of us, and told him gently that I had some experience in real estate development, and that I'd noticed a few structural vulnerabilities in the way Pinnacle was organized, some exposure I thought he should know about. I wasn't specific. I was careful. But I was offering him the truth, or at least the edge of it. He cut me off, not rudely, exactly, but firmly, the way a busy man waves off a slow-moving pedestrian. He said he had advisors who understood the current market, and that the old models of doing things just didn't apply anymore. He said he meant no disrespect, but that I was thinking like a man from a different generation. That was the last time I offered. And then came the birthday dinner. Claire turned 35 in April, and Marcus reserved a private dining room at the best restaurant in Knoxville, a place with a sommelier and no prices on the menu. The kind of place where the food is good, but what you're really paying for is the performance of having arrived. I wore a sport coat I'd owned for 15 years. It was well made and fit me perfectly. In Marcus's world, this was a character flaw. I arrived early, the way I always do, and sat at the end of the long table and watched the room fill with Marcus's friends, younger couples, all of them dressed in the language of recent money, all of them orbiting Marcus the way planets orbit something that seems, from a distance, to generate its own light. Claire was radiant and nervous in the particular way she got when she was hoping a family event would go smoothly. I smiled at her from across the room, and she smiled back, and in that smile was the whole of the 29 years since I'd held her in the hospital and promised her mother I would always keep her safe. The evening started pleasantly enough. The wine came, the appetizers came. Marcus held court at the center of the table with a story about a development deal he'd just closed. A new mixed-use project on the edge of downtown, the biggest thing Pinnacle had ever taken on. The numbers he quoted were real. What was also real, and what only Diane and I knew, was that Cumberland Capital had underwritten 60% of that deal too. I ate my food and listened and said nothing. And then Marcus's business partner, a loud man named Derek who laughed at everything Marcus said, leaned back and said the company wouldn't be where it was without Marcus's vision, and Marcus lifted his wine glass and agreed, and looked down the table at me with an expression I can only describe as assessment, the look of a man measuring a smaller man in his peripheral vision. And then he said it. He said, "You know, Dad, I've always respected that you were a hard worker. Blue-collar backbone of America, all that. But if I'm being honest," and he paused here, and the table got quiet, and I watched Claire's hand tighten on her fork. "You've never actually built anything. Not really. You maintain things other people built. There's a difference. I think that's why we've never quite seen the world the same way." Raymond understood that when he met me. He said right away I had the mind of a builder. Raymond. That was Derek's older brother, a commercial broker who had become Marcus's newest mentor figure, a man with a louder personality than sense, and a talent for making regular things sound transformative. I had never met Raymond. I had heard his name approximately 40 times in the previous 8 months. And then, in front of 40 people, Marcus raised his glass toward Derek and Raymond, who wasn't even there, but whose ghost was apparently present, and said, "To the men who build, not the men who sweep up after them." The table laughed. Not everyone, but enough. And Claire kept her eyes down. I sat with it for one breath. 2. The way you pause on a high point before a controlled demolition to make sure everyone is clear of the area. And then I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, stood up without scraping my chair against the floor, looked at Claire, just at Claire, not at Marcus, and I said, "Happy birthday, sweetheart. Dinner's been taken care of." And I walked out. Marcus thought that was the punchline. I heard later from Claire's friend Becca, who texted her the next morning with barely concealed delight, that Marcus had laughed after the door closed and said, "See? He paid for dinner. That's his move. That's all he's got." He then spent the rest of the evening in an excellent mood. He had 48 hours left in that mood. The next morning I sat across from Diane in her office on the 6th floor of a building in Market Square, a building I happen to own, and she made me a cup of coffee the way she always does when she knows we're crossing a line we can't uncross. She sat next to me instead of behind her desk, which is how she tells me she's with me, not just working for me, and she asked me if I was certain. I told her I was certain the moment I saw Claire keep her eyes on her plate. Diane had always hoped we'd never need to use the protocol. She had called it Sequoia after the neighborhood, after the house, because she said whatever we built should carry the name of the place that mattered most. She asked me to walk her through what had happened. Not the legal part, the human part. I told her Marcus had looked at me like a janitor at a party he'd thrown, in front of 40 people, on my daughter's birthday. And the worst of it wasn't the insult. The worst of it was that he believed every word he said. He genuinely believed that the world he was standing in was the world he had built. Diane picked up her pen, and we began. We designed it the way I design every load-bearing structure, carefully, sequentially, with each element timed for maximum clarity rather than maximum damage. Not dynamite at the base. A controlled demolition. Take the visible things first, so the person understands what's happening as it happens. Let each loss teach the lesson that the previous comfort had been hiding. We spread it across 3 days. On the Monday following the birthday dinner, Marcus drove down to the Pinnacle parking garage in his pressed suit, expecting his black SUV, and found a tow truck. A driver in gray overalls who was unimpressed by either the suit or the tone of voice that came with it. The driver had a work order issued by a fleet management company Marcus had never heard of. The company name meant nothing to him, but it was one of mine. Marcus called the leasing company 3 times. On the 3rd call, a calm woman confirmed that the legal owner of the vehicle had exercised its right to repossess based on a material breach in the underlying lease agreement, and the matter was not open for discussion. He stood in the concrete garage in a $1,000 suit and watched his car get winched up a ramp. I know this because the building's parking garage had security cameras, and the footage came through Diane's property manager before noon. I didn't watch it with pleasure, but I did watch it because an engineer always reviews the test results. On Tuesday, Marcus arrived at his glass-walled office in downtown Knoxville via rideshare, 40 minutes late and already at half power. He stopped at the lobby coffee counter. He had a standing order there, coffee for the whole team, charged to Pinnacle's corporate card. The card was declined. The barista ran it twice. The people in line behind him watched with the particular cruelty of strangers who have witnessed someone powerful absorb a small public humiliation. He went upstairs to his corner office and opened the company's financial portal. Access denied. He tried 3 times, slowly, then fast, then slow again, as people do when they cannot accept what the screen is telling them. The system was locked. A formal email from Cumberland Capital's legal representative arrived that afternoon, informing him that the majority shareholders had suspended all executive financial access, pending an emergency internal audit effective. Immediately, no timeline given, no appeal process outlined. His phone rang 20 minutes later. It was Raymond. Not the wise, authoritative Raymond Marcus had built into a mythological figure at dinner. A different Raymond, entirely high-pitched, frantic, demanding to know why the monthly consulting retainer from Pinnacle hadn't deposited. Because Raymond had a mortgage due on Friday and a payment on his car, and if this was some kind of accounting error, Marcus needed to fix it today. The man Marcus had toasted as a visionary was screaming at him about overdraft fees. Because Raymond's consulting contract, his only real income was paid through Pinnacle's accounts. Pinnacle's accounts were controlled by Cumberland. Cumberland was mine. And here's the thing I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is the thing that contains the whole story. Raymond was not a self-made man. Raymond was a man performing a life he could not afford, and the only thing keeping the performance running was money that flowed, invisibly, from the man he'd never bothered to meet. The man Marcus had called a floor sweeper was the ceiling holding the whole room up. And when that ceiling quietly withdrew, all the men who'd been standing under it suddenly had nowhere to look but down. On Wednesday morning, Claire was home alone when the knock came at the front door. She opened it to a man in a dark blazer holding a manila envelope and introducing himself as the property manager for the home she and Marcus had been living in. She called Marcus, who had been sitting in his locked office, staring at his phone, and he drove back to Sequoia Hills in another rideshare, which at this point was almost a metaphor. The property manager walked through the house with the quiet, systematic attention of someone inventorying an asset, which is exactly what he was doing, because the house was mine. The lease Marcus and Claire had signed, the remarkable, practically free lease that Marcus had taken as proof of his own prestige, contained a clause he had never read, which made the entire arrangement contingent on Marcus's continued standing as an active executive in good standing at the company. Since the majority shareholders had suspended his access, he no longer qualified. The notice gave them 72 hours. Claire's voice on the phone to me that afternoon was the voice of someone who has been told the floor is water. She wasn't angry. She was disoriented. She said, "Dad, something is happening. Something is very wrong and I don't understand it." And I said, "I know, sweetheart. I need you to ask Marcus to come see me. Tonight. Both of you." I waited in my study. The same small room where I had opened the Delaware files 6 years ago, where the blueprints of my actual work covered the walls, where a framed photograph of Claire at 7 years old, sitting on the hood of my truck on a job site wearing my hard hat, absolutely beaming, sat on the corner of my desk. I looked at that photograph for a long time before I heard the car in the driveway. I let the doorbell ring twice. Then I said through the intercom to come in. Marcus walked in first. He did not look like the man who had raised a glass to the builders of the world 3 days ago. He looked like a man who had been awake since Sunday and was now standing in the rubble of something he didn't fully understand yet. Claire came in behind him, her eyes moving from Marcus to me and back, trying to read the room. I gestured to the 2 chairs across from my desk and told them to sit down. My voice was quiet. There was no argument in it. They sat. I turned the monitor so they could both see it. And then, folder by folder, document by document, I showed them everything. I showed them the incorporation papers for Cumberland Capital. I showed them my name as the sole beneficiary of the trust that owned it. I showed them the original investment memo, the one doctor Ashford had presented to Marcus in that Charlotte conference room 7 years ago, and I showed them the email thread between Ashford and Diane, scheduling the meeting, renting the room, confirming the details. I said, very quietly, "You don't own Pinnacle, Marcus. You've never owned Pinnacle. You own 20% as CEO. The other 58% belongs to a trust that I control. The board of directors you've never met, that's me." Marcus shook his head slowly, the way people do when reality is moving faster than comprehension. He said, "That's not possible." I didn't argue. I moved to the next document. I showed them the fleet management company, the holding company behind the lease. I said, "You didn't earn that car. You were permitted to drive it. When your behavior made that permission no longer appropriate, the permission ended." I showed them the deed to the house in Sequoia Hills, my name, my company. I explained the incentivized lease, the clause, the 72 hours. I said, "You were my daughter's husband, living in my house. I was glad to provide it. The arrangement is no longer tenable." And then I opened the final folder. I said, "You toasted Raymond at dinner. You called him a builder. You called him a real man. Let me tell you about Raymond." I showed them a single document, the consulting contract between Pinnacle Group and Raymond's firm. Monthly retainer, 12 months, auto-renewing. I said, "That contract is Raymond's only client, his only income, and Pinnacle is funded by my trust, which means every dollar Raymond has earned in the past 4 years came from me. I paid his mortgage. I put gas in the car he drove to your birthday dinner, Claire. The man your husband called a visionary was on my payroll." The silence in that room had weight. The kind of structural weight that doesn't make noise but you can feel in your chest. Marcus stared at the screen. The anger had gone out of him somewhere in the middle of the second document, and what replaced it was something I had never seen on his face before: genuine, unguarded humiliation. Not the performance of humiliation, the real thing. But I had one more thing to say, and it was the most important. And I want you to hear it, because this is where I think most of these stories get it wrong. I looked at my son-in-law and I said, "I'm not telling you this to destroy you. I'm telling you this because you are the father of my grandchild." Claire's hand went to her stomach, because she was 11 weeks along and they hadn't told anyone yet, and I had known for 3 weeks because Claire had told me first, the way she'd always told me things first, and that child deserves a father who knows what real work looks like. Not a performance of work. The actual thing. I told him I had tried to show him this, once, at my kitchen table over coffee, before any of this existed. I reminded him of what I'd offered 2 years, side by side, learning the foundation. I said I had not built his world to trap him. I had built it because I loved my daughter, and I had made a promise to her mother, and at the time it seemed like the only way to keep it. I was wrong, I said. I know that. Money without truth isn't a gift, it's a cage. I built you a cage, Marcus, and I'm sorry for that. But the door is open now. I closed the laptop. I told him that the trust still existed, that his 20% was still his, dormant, not dissolved. That pinnacle could be rebuilt, legitimately, with his name on the actual paperwork, if he was willing to start from the thing I had offered him at the beginning, the real foundation, the unglamorous part, the part nobody photographs. But I would not put another dollar in until he had spent 1 year doing work he could not perform. A real job, a paycheck earned with actual labor, something that required him to be accountable to someone other than himself. If you want your life back, I said, go earn it, all of it, and when you've done that, call Diane. She'll know what to do. Then I stood up, my knees aching, the way they always do in the evenings now, and I walked out of my own study and left them there with the truth, which is the heaviest and most useful thing I have ever built. The weeks that followed were the quietest I had known in years. No manufactured crises. No calls from Marcus needing intervention. No triangulated guilt through Claire. Just the particular peace that comes from a structure that has finally been cleared. I sat on my back porch most mornings with coffee, watching the oak tree I'd planted the year Claire was born, now tall enough to shade the whole yard. Claire called me every few days. She was not angry, which surprised me. She said she was processing. She said she had known something was wrong for a long time, longer than she'd admitted, and that she was figuring out what she wanted. I told her whatever she decided I would be there, in the same place, the way I had always been. She said she knew that. She said that was the one thing she had always known. About 6 weeks later, my phone rang. Number I didn't recognize. I picked up. It was Marcus. No practiced confidence in his voice. No performance. Just a man speaking at a normal register, which was the first time I had ever heard him do it. He said he'd gotten a job. Site management assistant at a commercial construction company in Maryville, 40 minutes south of Knoxville, entry level, early hours. He said the foreman was 31 years old and did not care what Marcus had run previously, and expected him to show up on time and learn things without commenting on how they used to be done at his company. He said it was the hardest thing he'd done in his life. He said he thought he was starting to understand what I had been trying to show him at that kitchen table. I didn't say much. I asked how Claire was. He said she was good. He said they were working on things, slowly. He said the baby was healthy. I told him I was glad to hear it. Then I said, Marcus, call me when you've got a year in. We'll have coffee. He said he would. And I believed him, not because I'm an optimist, but because I have spent 30 years reading structures, and I could hear in his voice something that had not been there before, a small, load-bearing thing that had not existed until the false floor was taken away. The actual foundation. After I hung up, I stayed on the porch for a while, the chair rocking slow, the oak tree holding its ground the way it always has. My wife would have said something wise and brief about all of it, the way she always did something that made 30 years of patience sound simple and obvious. I missed her the way you miss a load-bearing wall after it's gone. You understand its purpose most completely in the silence where it used to be. But I was all right. I had done the one thing I had always done, built something meant to last. Not for credit, not for applause. For the person standing on top of it, who would one day, I hoped, look down and understand what was underneath. Before I let you go, I want to ask you something. because you've stayed with me this far, and I think that means something. Do you think I did the right thing? Comment 1 if you believe I was justified, that tough love and full truth were the only things left that could help him. Comment 2 if you think I should have revealed the truth years earlier, before it got this far. Or comment 3 if you think the real failure was mine from the beginning, that I built the cage and can't pretend otherwise. And wherever you're watching from, tell me. Tell me what time it is where you are. I'm always moved by how far a quiet man's story can travel. Have you ever held something up in silence, while the people standing on it told you that you'd never built a thing? Tell me about it. I read everything. If this story found something real in you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, because we tell stories like this one, stories about quiet people and what they were holding all along, and the moment the truth finally comes into the light. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. It means more than you know.